Hello, world, and welcome. Welcome to episode 19 of the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlund, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, but representing all states of the New England region and probably reaching beyond that at some point. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you've been enjoying these podcasts. I appreciate each and every one of you that have taken a moment of your time to check out something that I'm very passionate about. Any of you that have never tuned in, this is New England travel, history, some fun and enlightening lifestyle topics, and a heaping pile of 80s and 90s nostalgia, some of it embarrassing at my expense. I got to give a shout out to a fan that I made, someone that's listened to a bunch of my podcasts. I say I'm a 12th generation Cape Codder, which I am. I go back to Doan family, Deacon John Doan, episode 1. He's the first person I talk about. So when you get high praise from someone that's a 13th generation Cape Codder, that means something. So thank you to Diane, a great photographer. We follow each other on Instagram. I appreciate that. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that she gave me a shout. 13th generation. That's like my nieces Kaylee and Emma and my nephew Landon. They're the 13th generation Cape Codders. But they don't really care about that right now. But hey, neither did I when I was in my teens and early 20s. I couldn't have cared less about my family history. And for anyone else out there who has been listening, if you ever have questions, comments, shoot me an email, christophersetterlund@gmail.com. You can email me through my website, christophersetterlund.com, or find me on social media. I'm always looking for the interaction with people that are listening. That's why I do the Without a Map live streams every Friday at 8 p.m. on Instagram. Be on the lookout, though. On Monday, May 24th, I'm doing a book launch live stream, May 24th at 7:30. That is for my 6th book, Iconic Hotels and Motels of Cape Cod, which is being released. You can actually pre-order it now through the History Press and Amazon. It is completing my trilogy of Cape Cod history. Historic restaurants of Cape Cod Nights, and now Iconic Hotels and Motels, all through the History Press of Arcadia Publishing. I actually was smart recently and joined a Facebook group for podcasters where they help you with ideas and sharing your experiences as a podcaster. I'm constantly looking for new ways to market my podcast and always looking for feedback and brainstorming. It only took me 6 months to figure out I should join a Facebook group. So yeah, sometimes I'm a little slow. I hope all of the mothers out there had a great Mother's Day. It just passed. I hope all of you were good to your mothers of your children, grandparents, aunts, siblings that have kids. I thought it was fun. Last week, I decided to so my podcast is hosted by buzzsprout.com, and then it's sent out to all the podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon, Google. But Buzzsprout, you can check kind of your analytics and see about your downloads. And the thing that I find interesting was I was checking to see where people were listening from. So I thought I would share that. So obviously United States is like 95% of my downloads. No surprise. Second place, though, was France. So I wanted to give a shout out to anyone from France who is listening. But back here in America, so obviously places in Massachusetts are high up on my list as far as cities go where they're listening to the podcast. But outside of New England, the 2 top cities that are downloading this podcast are Manhattan and Atlanta. So I wanted to give shout outs to anyone in Manhattan, New York, anyone in Atlanta, Georgia, who has taken a few moments to listen to any of these podcasts. Shoot me a message if you're from there or if you're listening from far away. Let me know where you're from. I'll shout you out. It's awesome to feel your work spreading across the country. And speaking of my work, let's dive in. This is episode 19. I'm really excited because I'm starting a new segment called Restaurant Storytime, which is going to be stories of my nearly 2 decades working in the restaurant industry. Names will be changed to protect the innocent. I'm going to do all I can to make these super funny and not embarrass anyone, so I will likely This one this week, I'm not naming names. It'll just be this person, that person, not someone's name. We're going to take a road trip up to quintessential Maine, Owl's Head. I loved it there. Hope you'll love this segment. I'm going to go way, way back in the day to the first children's books that I remember reading, mostly picture books, but who knows? Hopefully they bring back good memories for you. And of course, we've got This Week in History with a new time capsule. So jump on board. Let's get started. This is episode 19 of the podcast. I am Christopher Setterlund. Thank you for tuning in, and let's go take a walk. Being someone that worked in the restaurant industry for basically 2 decades, I amassed a lot of incredible stories, these funny things that you wouldn't believe happened, and I've wanted to share those on the podcast for a while. It was just a matter of figuring out how to tell them without embarrassing anyone or incriminating anyone. I wrote these blogs. I mentioned in the previous episode, I did an offshoot blog. I've been revamping it with the Child of the 80s stuff. But another part of that was my story time from the restaurant. Anyone that knows me knows what restaurant it was. I'm going to kind of keep that under wraps because the restaurant still exists, though not in the same form. And none of these stories that I'll tell as we go along in the podcast episodes are illegal or anything like that. But I don't think everyone wants their stories and memories shared for all of you to download and listen to. So we're going to try this one out here. This is going to be just called Restaurant Story Time. If you like it, let me know, and we can have this as a recurring segment as we go along because I have hundreds of great stories that you won't believe are real, but they are. Restaurant Storytime number 1 takes us back to 2002, 2003. At this restaurant I worked at, it was a smaller restaurant building, and across the parking lot was a barn with our prep room in there, along with our walk-in refrigerator and freezer. When it got to be busy in the restaurant or wintertime and you didn't want to walk across the parking lot to get something, you needed to alert the person in the prep room. And when they came outside, you just kind of shout to them, "This is what I need," and you bring it over. I remember at one point, we had this intercom system put in, and it worked right for maybe a week, 2 weeks, and then it got to be real muffled and it wouldn't work. It was like trying to use a cell phone where there's no service. So you'd shout into the intercom and it would be all broken up and distorted. And eventually the person in the prep room would just come across to the kitchen and just say, "I couldn't understand you." And you yell at them and be like, "I needed you to get me a couple heads of lettuce. So go back and get it and then come back." When the intercom didn't work, and that was most of the time, if it was winter, we had another way to get people's attention, and that was making snowballs if they were available and throwing them at the broadside of the barn because you'd hear that noise inside there and you'd come out to see what the hell was going on. So our prep guy was over there. I threw a few snowballs, got his attention. He came out. I told him what we needed. And of course, being younger, in my early to mid-20s, I decided to make another snowball. And when he came out through the door to walk across the parking lot, I whipped it at him. I missed and hit the side of the barn. He was not amused with that, which made it funnier. So he brought the stuff over. He went back to do his job prepping, and it was a very slow day at the restaurant because of the snow. So I decided my main job that day would be to see how many times I could nail this guy with a snowball across the parking lot. I made half a dozen snowballs and left them sitting out on our deck at the back of the kitchen of this restaurant. And I'd throw one, hit the barn. He'd come out to see what I needed. And of course, I didn't need anything. I would just be there waiting to fire another snowball at him. And I'd throw the snowball and I'd miss him. And he'd go back inside mad. And then 20 minutes, half hour later, I'd do it again and miss him. I think after the second time, when I went a third time to throw a snowball at the barn, he didn't come out because he had finally figured out I didn't need anything. I was just looking to hit him with a snowball. So I decided to level up as far as my pranking went with the snow. I made myself a snowball and I said, if he's not coming out, I'm going in to get him. So I walked across the parking lot, making sure that I wasn't seen in the window. And we had a screen door and a regular storm door to get into this barn/prep area. And I was real quiet. I went in And we would always have a radio in there playing music, so he really didn't hear me when I sneaked into the prep room. And in this prep area, there was a main room right at the door where the walk-in refrigerator and the freezer was, and then there was another room in the back. So this prep guy was totally shielded. Like, he could not see what was about to happen to him. And I walk into this second room, and he's got his back to me. He's chopping lettuce for salads. And I see him, and for a second I started thinking, maybe I shouldn't do this because he's not suspecting and he's doing his job. So I compromised. Instead of hitting him from behind like an ambush, I decided I'd give him a heads up. So I just shouted. I went, "Hey!" And he turned around, and he had these big, thick, black-rimmed glasses, and his eyes got huge. He saw me with the snowball cocked, and I'll never forget, he pressed himself up against the wall. It looked like something out of Friday the 13th, like you had been cornered by Jason Voorhees, and he's pressed against the wall just screaming, "No, no, no." And all of this combined, I started laughing so hard at his horror that when I fired that snowball at him from 10, 12 feet away, I missed so badly because I was laughing. I hit the clock on the wall, which came flying off the wall and spun, hit off the shelves and hit the floor. And I ran out of the prep room back to the kitchen, just laughing my head off. He was not amused. I think it took him a few weeks to trust that I wouldn't do that again, because I was known to play pranks on this prep guy a lot. Hey, I was young. What do you want? I mean, things like putting Tabasco sauce in his drink and stirring it with a straw so he wouldn't know, or taping his straw shut so he couldn't drink. Man, now that I think of it, I'm kind of like Jim from The Office with Dwight, but that was a classic story time from my restaurant days. Funny thing is, we actually had a time with the snow when it would be slow there that I believe all of us that were working there that day, we just abandoned our posts because there were no customers, and we went out in the parking lot and we had a big snowball fight with like a dozen of us hiding behind fences and other people's cars. It was a different world back then at that restaurant. It wasn't like Animal House, like in a bad way, because we did our jobs, and we did our jobs well, and the customers loved and respected the work we did and the food we made. But we got away with a lot of stuff that you couldn't do today. But that's the story of my snowball ambush for the first restaurant story time. If you enjoyed it, let me know on social media or something, and I'll pick another one and put one up on the podcast in an upcoming episode. Summer is right around the corner. What better way to celebrate the oncoming of summer than by adding something great to your wardrobe by going to wearyourwishes.com. Since its launch back at the end of February, products have been flying off the shelves on the website, but it's so much more than hoodies and joggers and sweatpants. There's new stuff coming, so you've always got to make sure to go back and check the website, shoot an email to Katie Marks, the owner, find out about what's coming up. I can share with you some new things coming, including towels, pillows, and throws, and new apparel. There's a new logo coming that I've seen that is amazing. But the big thing is coming near the end of June, right in time for the launch of summer, is the Mermaid Collection, a jewelry line, sterling silver with necklaces, bracelets, and rings for mermaid wishes and starfish kisses. There's a cube necklace and anklet, paper airplane bracelet. These are all coming soon to the website, so get ready. And like I said, if you go to the website and you see something you like, it is not there, it's sold out. It will be back on the shelves. Wear Your Wish has been doing some great work. It's a sign of success, and we're all very proud of the work that Katie has done. She's a 12th generation Cape Codder, so a lot of that stuff, you locals, Wear Your Wish is as local as it gets. So get ready for summer. Check out the clothing and apparel and accessories at wearyourwishes.com. Wear Your Wish. Check it out. It's got everything you need for summer coming up. So I know I had promoted for this road trip doing a combination of two quintessential Maine towns. As I got longer into doing the research and putting the segment together, I realized both of these deserve their own episodes of the podcast. So rather than doing both Owl's Head and Rockland, Maine, I decided to start with just Owl's Head and give you a little bit of what makes this literally like a quintessential Maine town for me. Located about 200 miles north of Boston, with a population of just over 1,600 as of 2018. Owl's Head is a small town. It's like a little peninsula bordered by the towns of Rockland and Thomaston. I was lucky enough that many years ago, I went up to Maine for this long vacation road trip when I started doing the travel writing back in 2010. And I was lucky enough to stay at my cousin's then husband. The two of them, they owned a waterfront cottage, ironically on Cottage Avenue. It's now a private home, but I was lucky enough to stay there. This trip that I took up there was really the first long-term trip that I took somewhere, especially to Maine. I hadn't really gone to Maine that much, except maybe to go camping as a kid with my Aunt Kelly. Owl's Head I found to be the snapshot of when you close your eyes and picture what you think Maine is, that was Owl's Head. And it has a funny name. So Owl's Head got its name from mariners who thought that the shape of the rock ridge where Owl's Head Lighthouse stands looked like an owl. Owl's Head Lighthouse is easy to find. It's in the Owl's Head State Park at the end of Lighthouse Road. It's this little diminutive lighthouse. It looks like a little miniature, and it's at the top of this staircase and stands 100 feet above sea level right next to Rockland Harbor. The current lighthouse tower was built in 1852. There's interesting things, too. There's the grave of Spot, the lighthouse dog. It was a Springer Spaniel in the 1930s, and he would pull the bell on the fog signal and bark at passing boats. So he's buried near the fog bell. He's got a gravestone. It's interesting if you don't know what it is. It's weird to see a dog's grave on this walk out to the lighthouse. If lighthouses aren't your thing, though, but you do enjoy the nature, you've got to check out Birch Point Beach State Park. That's when I think of quintessential Maine. I think of that spot. You take a hike out there to the water, and there's a rock outcroppings with these tall pine trees all standing straight. You have to see it. I can't describe it. When I think of Maine, I just think of that spot. It's 62 acres in size, and Birch Point Beach is a little pocket beach, so it's not the whole area. And you've got this great view of the Muscle Ridge Channel Islands, which sit about a mile offshore. Maine is filled with islands offshore. There's so many of them, and a lot of them have lighthouses. The entrance to the state park is at 459 South Shore Drive, and the drive out there is amazing. Owl's Head is a little town. Obviously, the population is 1,600, so a lot of these drives from the downtown lead you to areas where there's not much. There's just a lot of open land. On Museum Street is the Owl's Head Transportation Museum, which that can be a day trip all in itself. There are originals and replicas of aircraft dating all the way back to 1804. There's a 13-inch unmanned glider built by Sir George Cayley, who was seen as the father of aviation. And there are a ton of incredible antique cars. I can't describe and name all the vehicles for you. Go to owlshead.org and just look. They have a gallery with these photos of some of these crazy-looking old cars. They have self-guided tours. You can do actual tours with people. I don't know how that goes with COVID still kind of hanging on. But the Owl's Head Transportation Museum is open year-round, so you can go anytime and check it out. It's definitely worth it. As far as going up there and staying overnight rather than trying to make a day trip out of checking out Owl's Head, hotels are a little hard to come by. You have a better shot at going to Rockland or Thomaston, but you can go on Airbnb, and I found several houses and apartments that are for rent where you can stay the night at an actual house up in Owl's Head. So that's a good idea. And quite honestly, I would definitely recommend staying overnight in Owl's Head. I know when I stayed up there at my cousin's cottage on the water, there was just this awesome feeling. They had this screened-in porch that I would just go and sit on, and it faced the Rockland Breakwater Lighthouse. So you'd have the light just going across the wall, just watching a lighthouse. And because that's something that, you know, if I want to go and watch a lighthouse now, you know, Cape Cod or something else, I've got to drive to it and then drive home. It's different sitting on your porch and just watching it. Now, granted, that wasn't the greatest thing when it was time to go to bed and the lantern, the beacon, was shining on the wall repeatedly. I had to sleep facing the wall, like covering my face, because then the lighthouse was a pain in the butt. Much like with hotels and lodging, if you want to go and have something to eat in Owl's Head, that's also something where you may be better off going into Rockland or Thomaston. But if you're not in the mood to go to Rockland or Thomaston, I mean, they're right there. They're the neighboring towns, but this is supposed to be about Owl's Head. You can't go wrong with having authentic Maine lobsters, and you can find that at the Owl's Head Lobster Company. They're at 23 Lobster Lane, and obviously they catch their lobsters and they sell them there. So sometimes the best thing you can do is buy your lobsters, and if you're staying somewhere, you do your own lobster bake. They're at a wharf on Owl's Head Harbor, so even if you've got to wait a little while to get your lobsters because they can get busy, the views there are incredible, so it's kind of a win-win. You can find them on Facebook at Owl's Head Lobster Company, and of course, you got to pick up everything else you need to go with the lobster. You can check out the Owl's Head General Store. They're at 2 South Shore Drive, and it's a classic vintage general store. Think of a general store in a small town in Maine. You can't go wrong. But if you think if it's just like a rustic general store, rustic shack throwback, you'd be wrong, though. They've got burgers that have been voted the best burger in Maine for 2 years in a row by Food Network, Village Soup, and the readers of Down East Magazine. So I think that comes highly recommended. Inside is also the home of the Midcoast Fudge Factory, so you can get some authentic homemade fudge, which all comes wrapped in quarter-pound pieces, so you can kind of mix and match. It's almost like getting jelly beans. Grab a little bit of each one and see what you like the best. Check them out at owlsheadgeneralstore.com. There really is a lot to see and do in Owl's Head. A lot of it, I love nature. I love hikes. That's my kind of thing, so going there and just having no direction is great. You know, it's great to go on a trip and have places to see, but it's even better to go and just say, I'm going to go where my feet take me and find something that just blows your mind. That was how I felt when I first saw Birch Point Beach State Park. It was just mind-blowing, quintessential Maine. There's something that just feeds the soul in Owl's Head. I really loved it. I loved it so much that a couple years ago, me and my buddy Steve, who I've talked about a bunch on this podcast, we did one of our big photo trips, and we drove from on Cape Cod all the way up to Owl's Head to get some photos of Owl's Head Lighthouse. And we left Cape Cod before 4 in the morning. So we drove, it's almost 5 hours from where I live to Owl's Head. And it was worth it to go all the way up there to just feel that vibe of small town classic Maine. I mean, I love Portland. I love Bangor. I've already spoken about Lubeck on a previous episode of the podcast. But there's something about Owl's Head that is like, if you had a stranger paint what they think Maine looks like, it would look a lot like Owl's Head. As I said, visit owlshead.org for more about the Transportation Museum. Owlshead.maine.gov is more of the actual town site, but it'll give you some useful information. My words won't do it justice. Go find some photos, go check out the general store, and let me know what you thought if you go to Owl's Head. If you love it as much as I have loved going to visit there, then that'll make me happy. And I'll be back with the next episode for another road trip to another one of the hundreds and hundreds of amazing places New England has to offer. One of the first achievements of any child's life is learning to read. It's right up there with potty training, learning to walk, learning to speak. According to WebMD, children usually start to read in first grade. And granted, what they read is very simple and basic. And a lot of them are picture books with very few words. But these first books, much like a lot of childhood memories, become very special and stick with you even into adulthood. That's the main part of a lot of these way back in the day segments, are these positive memories from childhood that have stuck with me. And I don't know about anyone else, but I can still remember those first books that I learned to read on my own. And I'm going to share some now and see how many you remember. as I often do on this podcast, to date myself, my first grade year in school was 1984. And I don't know exactly when I started reading. That's more of something my mother would probably be able to answer rather than me. Just like me saying, I don't know when I learned to talk or walk. You don't have those memories. My first memories of childhood come from when I was between 2 and 3 years old, and it's very, very few. But I digress. So, there's a name that should be familiar to all of you children of the 80s and probably 90s also, and that name is Richard Scarry. Scarry was spelled Scarry. Richard Scarry is actually from Boston. He was born in 1919. Most of his books, if you're thinking of Richard Scarry, you think of something called Busy Town. And when doing the research for this podcast, I only thought of them as Richard Scarry books, and I could picture the characters from it. So Busy Town was a place that was inhabited by anthropomorphic animals. Cats, dogs, pigs, foxes, and the popular Lowly the Worm, who rode around in an apple car. These Busy Town books were published from the mid-70s on, and so that's why they were hugely popular when I came of age as a reader. But the irony is that even though I think of Richard Scarry and Busy Town and 1980s reading, he actually had a career that was 45 years in length, and his career began in 1949 as an illustrator for the Little Golden books. And if you don't remember those, I know you've read those if you're my age. The Little Golden books had the binder that was golden in color, and some of the titles come straight out of my childhood, although they were from the 40s and 50s, like the Pokey Little Puppy, the Tawny Scrawny Lion, the Saggy Baggy Elephant. You sense a pattern here. Even Disney got in on the Little Golden books. They had like the Three Little Pigs in there. But Richard Scarry was an illustrator for them. In his career, he published more than 300 books, and that career ended when he died in 1994. But those books have sold more than 100 million copies, and you can still find them everywhere. Go on Amazon right now, and you can find Busy Town, tons of them. Another series of books that I remember being the first that I read, especially in school, like we had them in our little libraries at South Yarmouth Elementary School. So the author, his name was Roger Hargreaves. And when I say that name, you're probably just like, I have no clue who that is. But if I mention the Mr. Men and Little Miss books, that might bring it flooding back to you. So Roger Hargreaves was a British author, born in 1935. He created the Mr. Men series, and that began in 1971 with Mr. Tickle. And if you find the cover of the book, it's just this orange blob with a smile and these long wiggly arms. And these books, obviously they were made for kids, 5, 6, 7 years old, and they were basic. The covers had the main character, whoever it was, Mr. Greedy, Mr. Happy, Mr. Silly, Mr. Lazy, Mr. Funny, all those ones. And the books were focused on that character trait. And between 1971 and Hargreaves' death in 1988, there were 39 Mr. Men books. And in 1981, he created the Little Miss books, which began with Little Miss Bossy, and there were 24 of those. Roger's son, Adam Hargreaves, is still publishing books to this day. He took over when his dad died. There are 85 combined books between the two series, and they've combined to sell more than 100 million copies. Those are kind of the two series, the Busy Town and the Mr. Men, Little Miss books, that I really remember from my beginnings of reading. I'm talking first, second grade. As I went on in the 80s, obviously there were more. There was Roald Dahl and Judy Blume, Dr. Seuss and Beverly Cleary. Those were some of the authors, Shel Silverstein. But that'll be another segment on the podcast because I don't want to dive into all these books. You kind of lose the meaning. If I give you 50 examples of books I read, then you're going to lose some of them. Speaking of Beverly Cleary, it's amazing that she just passed away in March. She was 104 years old. Her birthday would have been April 12th. She would have been 105. That's just amazing. Today, it's a lot different, though. I don't know what kids read these days. Any of you out there that have kids, what do you get for your kids for books? Do you, if you're my age, do you fall into that category where you get the books you read and kind of pass it on? I think the first real, I don't want to say literature books that I read, but ones that went beyond just pictures and a few words were the Shel Silverstein books. Those were big time, especially because he was around in that time. You know, A Light in the Attic, that book came out in 1981 and is a collection of poems. So, I mean, they're not simple, but when you're 8, 9, 10 years old, you can read those and understand them. The other big book that Shel Silverstein released, the poetry book, was Where the Sidewalk Ends from 1974. And that's one of the best and one of the most controversial, I guess, children's books ever, because some of the poems in it are seen as profane and rebellious, and it's even been banned in some places. In second grade, when I actually read it, the only thing that I can tell you about Where the Sidewalk Ends is there's a poem in there called Spaghetti, and we had a contest. In my second grade class, my teacher was Ms. Rodriguez, and it was who could recite the poem fastest. And I don't know who won, but it was down to me and this girl named Abby, who was like my first crush in school. And it was like a freestyle rap battle as we recited the lyrics to this. So just for the podcast, I'm going to do a flashback 35 years to second grade. And I'm going to recite this poem for you all. I won't do it fast, though. Spaghetti, spaghetti all over the place, up to my elbows, up to my face, over the carpet and under the chairs, into the hammock and wound round the stairs, filling the bathtub and covering desk, making the sofa a mad, mushy mess. The party is ruined, I've terribly worried, the guests have all left, unless they're all buried. I told them bring presents, I said throw confetti, I guess they heard wrong, 'cause they all threw spaghetti. I haven't read that out loud in 35 years, so there you go. Just imagine it as an 8-year-old reciting it as fast as possible. But yeah, that book, Where the Sidewalk Ends, is seen as controversial now. I don't understand. Those were some of my first memories of reading, some of my first favorite books. What about you, children of the 80s, those close to my age? What did you read? What did you like? Did any of these bring back memories for you, or are you just like, I don't know what the hell these books are? I'm telling you, Richard Scarry, you can find those anywhere. If you've got little kids, definitely grab some Busy Town books or Little Golden books or any of those. They're awesome. But as LeVar Burton would say on Reading Rainbow, you don't have to take my word for it. Read it for yourself. There's nothing better first thing in the morning than a good breakfast. Maybe a good breakfast with a new release of my podcast, which drops at 5 a.m., but I digress. Cape Cod is home to many good breakfasts and some great breakfasts. And if you want the best of breakfast, there's only one place you can go, and that's Laura and Tony's Kitchen in Northeast Ham. Located on Route 6, right before the Wellfleet Drive-In, this spot has been providing the best breakfast buffet, small batch cooking. It's incredible. I've been there so many times, and I love it. Every time it's awesome. But COVID has unfortunately forced them to pivot some. So what's happening is they're going to be introducing Laura and Tony's Kitchen and Gourmet Market Cafe. They're reopening in mid-June, and they're going to be better than ever, the best of both worlds. They're going to be serving everything from their homemade bagels with the buttery smoked salmon, Tony's legendary Mexican noodles, crisp salads, organic grilled chicken sandwiches, gourmet all day. If you haven't been there, you need to get there when they reopen. If you have been there, you already know all about it. I would say they're a hidden gem, but if you've ever been there during the busiest parts of the days, you know everybody knows about Laura and Tony's. Before they reopen in June, you can go to lauraandtonys.kitchen.com, place some online orders, see what they've got. Also go to Laura and Tony's Kitchen at etsy.com. They offer free local delivery. Any questions, give a call to Laura at 508-221-7151. And be there when they reopen in mid-June. I'll definitely keep you updated, but I wanted to get the word out ahead of time. Laura and Tony's Kitchen and Gourmet Market Cafe. The best breakfast on Cape Cod, bar none. Be there. This Week in History starts off with a trip to the grocery store. 93 years ago this week, May 11th, 1928, the first National Stores grocery chain opens in Falmouth. This was obviously important because this was the first supermarket chain, and it actually had its beginnings in Somerville, Massachusetts in 1927. The Falmouth grocery store would be on Main Street near Walker Street for anyone that's from Cape Cod and knows Falmouth. The interesting thing about the first national stores was that the owner was a man named Charles Adams, and people that are longtime hockey fans might know him as the president and principal owner of the Boston Bruins starting in 1924. Then he owned the Boston Braves starting in 1927 and the Suffolk Downs Racetrack in 1937. Back when the hockey divisions had names, the Adams division was the Bruins division, and that's from Charles Adams. First national stores were the predecessors for places like Stop and Shop and Star Market, and later on around here, Purity Supreme, Angelo's. They stayed relevant until 1978 when the entire company was bought by Pick and Play Supermarkets in Ohio. By that time, they had changed their name from First National Stores to Finest, which was kind of an acronym of the first two letters of each word, Finast. By the mid-90s, Finest had gone out of business, but this week in history, 93 years ago, the first national grocery chain came to Cape Cod in the First National Stores in Falmouth. 414 years ago this week, May 13th, 1607, the town of Jamestown, Virginia is founded. The journey to what would become Virginia began December 6, 1606, on 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. 104 English men and boys arrived in North America and picked Jamestown on May 13th for their settlement, which was named after King James I. It became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The first president of the New Virginia colony was Edward Winfield, and the other 6 council members were Christopher Newport, John Martin, John Ratcliffe, George Kendall, John Smith, and Bartholomew Gosnold, who also discovered Cape Cod in 1602. Much like when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Colony in 1620, there was a mixed relationship between the settlers and the Powhatan Native American tribe. They sort of got along, sort of didn't, and within a few months, a lot of the settlers began to succumb to a variety of diseases. They were drinking the water from the salty river, and if it wasn't for the Powhatan tribe, the settlement likely would have failed within the first year in Virginia. By early 1610, 80 to 90% of the settlers that had arrived in Jamestown had died due to starvation and disease. But by 1619, the Virginia Company, which were the financial backers of this permanent settlement, had recruited and shipped over 90 women to be sent over to Jamestown, which they became the wives and started the families in Virginia, and this basically stabilized Jamestown. And at some point in a future podcast, I'll talk about my trip down to Jamestown when I did my big road trip in 2019. It's fascinating to go and see they're doing excavations right now, and it's so neat to be able to see the first permanent English settlement in North America from over 400 years ago. And it got off to a rocky start, but Jamestown, Virginia was founded 414 years ago this week in history. 152 years ago this week, May 10th, 1869, the United States Transcontinental Railroad is finished. The ceremonial last spike, which connected the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, was in Promontory, Utah. This made it possible for people to travel all across the United States without having to get off a train and take a wagon train at some point, which was far more dangerous. Plans for such a transcontinental railroad had been in an idea form since 1832, but it wasn't until 1853 that Congress finally gave the funds for the survey to figure out where to lay the tracks. In 1866, the construction of the railroads began from Omaha, Nebraska, and Sacramento, California. And the funny thing is that back then, obviously, I guess surveying wasn't as good because the 2 railroads, the 2 lines built right past each other, so they had to fix it so they'd actually meet up because they overlapped. And it was dangerous. Harsh winters and summer heat, 12-hour work days going through the Sierra Nevada mountains, avalanches, explosives. But from all that adversity, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific workers were able to finish laying nearly 2,000 miles of track by 1869, ahead of schedule and under budget. which I'm sure was the most important thing. And once this transcontinental railroad was finished, it made travel obviously take a lot less time. Journeys that had taken months by wagon trains or weeks by boat only took days. And that contributed to a rapid expansion of the West. And that all occurred with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad 152 years ago this week. And we're going to tie up some pop culture and some time capsule all together in one. We're going to go back 29 years to May 9th, 1992. And I chose that day because that was the series finale of the television show The Golden Girls, which was obviously the number one television show that week. The Golden Girls starred Betty White, B. Arthur, Estelle Getty, and Rue McClanahan as women in their 50s and then 60s and just their lives. It was really ahead of its time. And it's funny because when I was a kid, I never watched it because as a 10-year-old, who's going to want to watch a show about people that were my grandmother's age? But then as I got older, I started watching the show with my grandmother. And it was funny because that show now always reminds me of my Nana, The Golden Girls. And I'm not going to sing the song, but if you know it, now you've got it stuck in your head. Thank you for being a friend. The number one song in America was Jump by Criss Cross. They were the Mac Daddy and the Daddy Mac, and they wore their pants backwards. Well, all their clothes backwards, but I wouldn't recommend trying that. The song Jump was number one for 8 weeks, and I found it interesting because they were younger than me. Well, they're still younger than me, but younger than me then, and they had a number one song. That inflated my dreams of maybe being a singer-songwriter, saying, if they can do it and they're younger than me, hey, why can't I? Musical talent, that's why. The number one movie was Basic Instinct, starring Sharon Stone and Michael Douglas. This one, for kids of my age and around there, everyone knows the famous scene of Sharon Stone being interrogated when she's crossing her legs. It's like the most paused moment ever for young boys. It made $353 million on a budget of $49 million. It currently has a rating of 54% on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's slightly rotten, but I mean, don't let that... It's worth checking out if you like that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously I've seen it, but you know. And they made a sequel many years later that was not as good. And if you're wondering, that one made back about half of its budget, and it has a rating of 6% on Rotten Tomatoes, so stay clear of Basic Instinct 2. And finally, if you were looking to go out to eat, May 9th, 1992, you want a nice prime rib dinner with a salad and a baked potato, full cut size prime rib, you go to the Worst House restaurant in the Cape Cod Mall in Hyannis. You could get that whole thing for $8.95. The fun thing about doing things like that with finding prices and things, you have to browse the newspaper. So I was basically reading the newspaper from May 9th, 1992, seeing what else was in there interesting that you might like. I thought the prime rib dinner was the best. And the Worst House, my Aunt Kelly used to work there. So any Cape Codders that lived here in the late 70s through the early 90s, you might remember the Worst House. If not, it was just like basically like any other restaurant. But that'll tie up another This Week in History, another time capsule. Sorry if I got the Golden Girls theme stuck in your head. You can go and pause this and play it and get that earworm out of there. But I'll be back next week for more This Week in History. And that's going to do it for episode 19 of the In My Footsteps podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much to everyone who has been giving the podcast a try. I'm starting to amass episodes, so there's a lot to pick and choose from. A lot of great topics that I've covered and a lot more to come. Believe me, I am constantly adding new stuff to my future portfolio. Like I said, the restaurant Storytime was something brand new. If you like that, let me know. ChristopherSetterlund@gmail.com is my email. Any questions, comments, you can find me on social media. On Twitter, Chris Setterlund. Instagram, I've got a regular page, Christopher Setterlund. There's an In My Footsteps podcast page. The regular account, Christopher Setterlund, is where I do my live streams weekly, Fridays at 8 p.m. Do a little more in-depth dive into the podcast, and then just general fun stuff about life and my experiences with my life being like a Seinfeld episode and fun stuff, engaging with you and engaging with people that come into the chat. If you want to support the podcast, you can go to buymeacoffee.com and buy me a coffee. It's a donation. And just so you know, my donations that I've gotten, they're all going into purchasing ads for the podcast. So I'm basically reinvesting in myself. So if you donate to the podcast, I'm not going to take that and go buy Doritos or buy a bag of donuts or something. I'm really excited because coming up Saturday, so 2 days from the launch of this podcast on May 15th, I have a special bonus episode. This is something I'm probably going to start doing in the future, where the regular podcast is typically 50 minutes, just over 50 minutes. I'm going to start doing bonus episodes that are shorter, probably between 20 and 25 minutes on one topic in particular. So hopefully you enjoy those. I'm very proud to have episode 20, this bonus episode, be totally dedicated to my grandpa, John Sullivan. I've been thinking about doing this for a long time, and it's timing with the 2-year anniversary of his passing, so it's bittersweet, but I wanted to make it a positive thing where I look at his life and accomplishments and what he meant to me. So I really hope you'll tune in and give that one a listen and let me know what you think. And I'll have a full new episode next week, episode 21. On it, I'm going to get to share a lot about my new book, Iconic Hotels and Motels of Cape Cod, as this next episode will launch a few days before the official release of my book on May 24th. So I'll share a little bit about what went into it, what the book's about, why you should read it, and a few of the places in there that make it worth checking out. I'm going to share the story, the famous wreck of the Eldia tanker that was off the shore on the coast of Nauset Beach back in 1984, and the story around that. We're going to go way, way back in the day to staying at the Cape Cod National Seashore in 5th grade. That was kind of like the rite of passage for all the kids my age. I don't know if they still do it or if you did it at all the schools on Cape Cod, but I got some funny stories from that. And of course, there's This Week in History with a new time capsule and the wild story of child murderer Charles Freeman and his predictions on the end of the world. This was a Cape Cod guy, so get ready for that. It's pretty crazy. So remember to be on the lookout for episode 20 coming Saturday. So like right after this, you can go check that out. I really hope you enjoy that one. Out of all episodes that I've done, that's going to be the one I'm most proud of thus far. And remember, take time for yourself. Self-care is more important than anything else. Burnout is common, especially in the world the way it is today. Hopefully summer is going to make things better, but always take the time to work on your own happiness, things that make you happy. I know that I do Sunday podcast walks. I listen to a favorite podcast of mine and I'm just out in the sun, and that vitamin D makes me feel better and it's a nice escape. You may not like walking, but find whatever it is that makes you happy and focus on that, at least for a little while each day. But remember, in this life, don't follow in anyone else's footsteps. Make sure you create your own path and you enjoy every moment you can in this journey, because you never know. So it's better to enjoy today than regret tomorrow. And I'll be back Saturday. I'll be back next week. Check out the live stream on Fridays at 8 p.m. Thank you all so much, and I will talk to you again soon.